One of the most historically important native trees in eastern North America was the American chestnut, Castanea dentata. At one time, this tree was so common that people rarely spoke about it. It was not planted intentionally, it simply grew everywhere people lived. The American chestnut once dominated forests from southern Canada to the southeastern United States. In many Appalachian forests, it made up a quarter or more of all hardwood trees. While the American chestnut is most remembered today for how suddenly it disappeared, there was much more to this tree before that happened. It provided food for people and wildlife, durable wood for homes and farms, and stability for entire forest systems. For generations, people depended on the American chestnut without realizing how important it truly was. It was reliable, productive, and predictable. Although the American chestnut is now rare as a mature tree, it can still be found growing today in a very different form. So let's learn what the American chestnut was, how it lived, and why it still matters. For centuries, people benefited from the American chestnut without ever planning to. This tree was not grown for profit or decoration, it grew naturally, and people shaped their lives around it. One of the most important ways the American chestnut helped people was through food. Historical records and forest surveys show that chestnuts once made up a major portion of the autumn diet in Appalachia. Each fall, mature trees dropped thousands of nuts. Chestnuts were collected, stored, and eaten throughout winter. Unlike most nuts, American chestnuts were low in fat and high in carbohydrates. Nutrition studies later confirmed they provided energy similar to grains rather than oils. When crops failed, chestnuts filled the gap. They required no planting, no irrigation, and no care. Livestock benefited as well. Agricultural records from the 1800s describe hogs being released into chestnut forest each fall. The animals gained weight quickly, reducing the need for stored feed. The American chestnut also provided reliable wood. Forestry studies documented its high tannin content, which made the wood naturally rot resistant. Fence posts and structures built from chestnut often lasted for decades. Large trees also provided shade and shelter. Homes and work areas near chestnuts stayed cooler during summer months. People did not describe these benefits in scientific terms. They simply noticed that life was easier where chestnuts grew. Now that we've seen how the American chestnut helped people, the next step is to understand where this tree naturally grew and why it thrived there. The American chestnut was native to a wide region of eastern North America. Its range extended from southern Canada and New England down through the Appalachian Mountains into the southeastern United States. It was especially abundant throughout the Appalachian region. Ridges, slopes, and well-drained valleys supported large chestnut populations. Unlike trees that prefer wet ground, American chestnuts thrived on upland soils. They favored slopes where water drained quickly and soils remained slightly acidic. These conditions allowed chestnuts to grow tall and straight. They competed effectively for sunlight and space. In many forests, chestnuts formed a major part of the canopy. Their presence shaped light levels, soil conditions, and forest structure. Where American chestnuts grew, forests were productive and stable. Now that we understand where the American chestnut lived, we can take a closer look at its size, growth rate, and overall form. The American chestnut thrived in upland environments. It favored well-drained soils on ridges and slopes. Historical studies show chestnut forests were most common on sandy and loamy soils. These soils were usually acidic and low in nutrients. Unlike many large trees, the American chestnut did not tolerate standing water. It avoided floodplains and wet ground. Consistent rainfall supported its growth across eastern North America. Once established, the tree tolerated short periods of drought. Research on root systems shows chestnuts developed deep tap roots with wide lateral spread. This made them stable and wind resistant. The American chestnut responded quickly to disturbance. After fire or logging, it regenerated rapidly from seed and stump sprouts. These conditions allowed chestnuts to dominate upland forests for centuries. Next, we'll look at the leaves and how they function through the seasons. The leaves of the American chestnut were built for efficiency. They were long, narrow, and sharply toothed, often reaching 8 to 10 inches in length. This shape maximized sunlight capture while allowing air to move through the canopy. Forestry studies show the American chestnut had a high photosynthetic rate compared to other eastern hardwoods. This efficiency supported rapid growth and large size. Leaves emerged later in spring. This helped the tree avoid damage from late frost common in Appalachian regions. Once established, chestnut leaves were durable. Early field studies noted they stayed green longer than nearby oaks and maples, even during dry periods. The underside of the leaf was lighter in color. This reduced moisture loss and reflected excess sunlight. In autumn, chestnut leaves change color late. They turn pale yellow or bronze before dropping. Research on forest litter shows chestnut leaves decompose faster than many hardwood species. This returned nutrients to the soil quickly and supported surrounding plant life. The seasonal behavior of chestnut leaves helped fuel growth, nut production, and resprouting. Their loss changed forest structure and soil chemistry across eastern North America. Next, we'll examine the flowers of the American chestnut and how reproduction took place. The American chestnut did not rely on showy flowers. It relied on timing and efficiency. Flowering began in early summer, usually between June and early July. This reduced competition with other forest trees. The tree is monoecious, producing both male and female flowers. Male flowers form long catkins that release large amounts of pollen. Pollination occurred mainly through wind. Studies also show insects such as bees and flies visited flowers for pollen. Female flowers formed inside spiny burrs. By early fall, each burr contained 2 to 3 nuts. Historical records describe chestnut production as massive. Forestry studies estimated chestnuts made up as much as 25% of the hardwood canopy in some regions. Nuts dropped in late September and October. This timing provided food when wildlife needed it most. Chestnuts were more reliable than acorns. Research shows they produced consistently year after year. This stability supported large wildlife populations and human harvests. After the blight arrived, trees continued producing nuts briefly, but few survived long enough to mature. By the mid-20th century, chestnut harvests had disappeared. With them vanished a food system that had supported forests and people for thousands of years. Next, we'll examine how animals depended on the American chestnut and how its loss reshaped ecosystems. Before its decline, the American chestnut was one of the most important wildlife trees in eastern North America. Its value to animals came from 3 things: size, longevity, and food reliability. The nuts were the most obvious benefit. Chestnuts were high in carbohydrates, lower in fat than acorns, and easier to digest. Because they ripened earlier in the fall, they provided energy at a critical time of year. White-tailed deer fed heavily on fallen chestnuts. Historical wildlife surveys show higher deer body weights in regions where chestnuts were abundant. Black bears relied on chestnuts to build fat reserves before winter. In areas of the Appalachians, chestnuts once made up a major portion of their fall diet. Wild turkeys, grouse, and other ground-feeding birds consume large quantities of chestnuts. The nuts were easy to crack and provided fast energy. Squirrels and chipmunks depended on chestnuts as a staple food. Unlike acorns, chestnuts spoiled less quickly and could be stored more easily. Passenger pigeons, now extinct, were closely linked to chestnut forests. Historical accounts describe flocks feeding on chestnut mast for days at a time. Beyond food, the American chestnut provided physical habitat. Its massive size meant large branches, cavities, and hollow trunks. Older chestnuts developed internal rot while remaining structurally sound. This created nesting sites for owls, woodpeckers, raccoons, and bats. Studies of cavity nesting birds show that large, long-lived trees are disproportionately important. The chestnut filled this role across millions of acres. Insect life also benefited. Chestnut leaves supported moth and butterfly larvae. These insects became food for birds during breeding season. When the chestnut disappeared, the loss rippled outward. No single tree fully replaced its role. Oaks produced acorns, but less consistently. Beeches produced nuts, but not at the same scale. Wildlife populations did not collapse overnight. Instead, they adjusted downward over generations. Modern ecological studies describe this as a loss of keystone productivity. The chestnut was not just present, it powered the system. Today, chestnut sprouts still emerge from old root systems. Wildlife sometimes feed on the small nuts these young trees manage to produce. But the scale is different. The forest no longer pulses with chestnut abundance each fall. Understanding this loss helps explain why restoring the American chestnut matters, not just for nostalgia, but for rebuilding ecological balance. Next, we'll look at how humans relied on the American chestnut and why its disappearance reshaped rural life in the eastern United States. For centuries, people across eastern North America depended on the American chestnut in everyday life. This dependence was practical, routine, and often taken for granted. In many rural areas, the chestnut was considered the most useful tree in the forest. It provided food, building material, fuel, and income, all from a single species. Chestnuts were a reliable food source for people. They were easy to collect, easy to store, and easy to cook. Families roasted them, ground them into flour, or boiled them as a staple food. Unlike many other nuts, chestnuts were low in fat and high in carbohydrates. This made them especially valuable for labor-intensive farm communities. Historical nutrition records show chestnuts were a seasonal calorie source similar to grains. In Appalachian communities, chestnuts were fed to livestock as well. Hogs, cattle, and poultry fattened quickly on fallen nuts. This reduced the need for stored feed going into winter. Chestnut wood was equally important. It was straight-grained, lightweight, and naturally rot-resistant. Because of its high tannin content, chestnut wood resisted decay without chemical treatment. Fence posts made from chestnut could last decades in the ground. Homes, barns, and sheds were commonly framed with chestnut lumber. It was easy to work by hand and widely available. Railroad ties, telegraph poles, and shingles were often made from chestnut. In some regions, entire industries relied on it. Studies from the early 1900s estimate that up to 25% of hardwood standing volume in parts of the Appalachians was American chestnut. Its loss represented not just a tree dying, but a regional economic collapse. Chestnut bark was also valuable. It was rich in tannins used for leather tanning. Tanneries depended on chestnut bark for processing hides. This created seasonal work for rural families who stripped bark and sold it for cash. For many households, chestnut-related income paid taxes or bought supplies. Importantly, chestnuts did not require deliberate planting. They grew naturally and abundantly. People built their lives around what the forest already provided. When the blight arrived, this system disappeared within a generation. Food sources vanished. Building materials became expensive. Local industries collapsed. Older residents later described the loss as sudden and shocking. Forests that once fed people simply stopped doing so. Modern economic historians describe the chestnut blight as one of the largest ecological disasters to directly affect rural livelihoods in U.S. history. Understanding how deeply people relied on the American chestnut explains why its loss is still remembered today. It was not just a tree, it was infrastructure. Next, we'll look at what caused the chestnut's sudden collapse and how a single disease reshaped an entire continent's forest. The disappearance of the American chestnut did not happen slowly. It happened with shocking speed. In the early 1900s, a fungal disease known as chestnut blight appeared in North America. The fungus, Cryphonectria parasitica, was accidentally introduced through imported Asian chestnut trees. Asian chestnut species had evolved with this fungus. They developed natural resistance over thousands of years. The American chestnut had no such defenses. The fungus entered the tree through small cracks in the bark. Once inside, it formed cankers that cut off the flow of nutrients and water. Above the infection, the tree slowly starved. Within a few years, infected trees died back to the roots. In many cases, entire forests of chestnut were lost in less than 2 decades. By the 1940s, an estimated 4 billion American chestnut trees were dead. This figure is supported by forestry surveys and historical records. The speed of the collapse left little time for response. Foresters initially believed the disease might run its course. It did not. Chestnut blight spread rapidly along railroads, roads, and natural corridors. Spores traveled on wind, insects, birds, and human activity. Large, mature trees died first. Saplings followed soon after. One of the most devastating aspects of the blight was its persistence. Although the above-ground tree dies, the root system often survives. Chestnut roots send up new shoots. These shoots grow quickly, sometimes reaching 20 feet tall, but before they can mature, the blight returns. This cycle has repeated for more than a century. As a result, the American chestnut exists mostly as small sprouts rather than full trees. Studies from the U.S. Forest Service confirm that chestnut still survives underground across much of its former range. However, flowering and seed production are extremely rare. The loss of mature chestnuts reshaped forest structure. Species such as oak, maple, and hickory expanded into the gaps. Wildlife that depended heavily on chestnut nuts lost a major food source. This altered feeding patterns and population dynamics. For people, the change was immediate and lasting. What had once been a dependable resource disappeared almost overnight. The chestnut blight became a defining example of how invasive pathogens can transform ecosystems. It remains one of the most studied forest disease events in the world. Understanding this collapse is essential to understanding why efforts to restore the American chestnut continue today. That story is where we go next.